Good evening and welcome to the New York Symposium with Diane Sayre. I'm Diane Sayre, LaRouche independent candidate for U.S. Senate in New York in 2024, and today is May 5th. We're just a few days away from VE Day, Victory in Europe, a day when people in the West, you would think, would be celebrating the victory of the Allied forces, the US, the Soviet Union, the British, over the Nazis. But we're not going to be celebrating that. In fact, we seem to be aiding and abetting an attempted assassination of Russian President Vladimir Putin, which occurred a couple of days ago in this attempted drone strike on the Kremlin. And we are going to be talking today about the legacy of Lyndon LaRouche, which is very important, I think may be crucial to the United States finally coming down on the right side of history, because what was done in the LaRouche case really did set a precedent, as former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark warned when he took the case. But let me just bring you up to date so you have a sense of the precipice on which we now find ourselves. So the spokesman for the Kremlin, Dmitry Peskov, speaking to reporters yesterday morning, said of the responsibility for the drone attack that, quote, such decisions, choices of targets, choice of means, etc., are dictated to Kiev from Washington. And he said that the denials by the Ukrainians and the US that either of them were involved, he said, were laughable. Blinken, our Secretary of State, made it even worse by saying that, well, of course, Ukraine will defend. He said, I believe Ukraine, they didn't do this. Again, like blaming the Nord Stream pipeline bombing on Russia, saying that Russia would stage an attack on the Kremlin is absurd. They have no reason to do that. They are winning the war in Ukraine, contrary to the propaganda of the West. And unfortunately, the United States has not condemned this attack, nor has the United States done what I would do and what I would demand if I were in the U.S. Senate or President of the United States, is that the United States will cut off all aid to Ukraine if they persist in this behavior, because attempting to assassinate the head of state of a major nuclear superpower could lead to the annihilation of the human species and everything else on this planet, and that is not acceptable. So that would be my message were I running the United States today or making policy. Unfortunately, we have people in positions of power in this country who believe you can have such a thing as a limited nuclear war. And I would point people to the LaRouche Pub, LaRouchepub.com, LaRouchepub.com website, where there is a dossier on the plot to break up Russia, which has been in effect really for decades, and some of the writings coming from raving neocon institutions like the Hudson Institute, where people say that it's really laughable to say a nuclear war would be a war of annihilation. It's just not true. We can have a little nuclear war, a little nuclear bomb here and there, and it wouldn't really affect anything, and don't worry about it. So unfortunately, that level of insanity seems to have the upper hand in Washington. That's why it's so urgent that citizens must act. Now, let me just continue. There's some coverage in RT and an interview with the Deputy Foreign Minister, Sergei Ryabkov. And they quote a senior Russian diplomat as having said, quote, "We are working on preventing a fall of our relations with the U.S. into the abyss of an open armed conflict. We are already on the verge of this abyss." Ryabkov, for his part, described the officials in Washington as, quote unquote, opponents and enemies of Russia due to what he characterized as Russophobic policies, which are being pursued in spite of the risks. Quote, the anger and hatred toward Russia with which Washington acts in a situation in which it frankly should think of its own safety is inexplicable, unquote. And then he said that there is, quote, no real diplomacy, unquote, regarding the Ukraine conflict between the two nations. It is not possible. He said, quote, the U.S. has long been a direct participant in the conflict and has long been waging an open hybrid war against my nation, unquote. He further went on to say, and this was echoed by the deputy ambassador to the United Nations, Dmitry, I'm blanking out his name. Jose, tell me his name.
Polyansky.
Yes, Polyansky, Ambassador Polyansky today, who said that everything Russia says, even though it's true, is labeled as Russian disinformation. And even when they're not saying anything, when they're merely calling for an investigation, like shouldn't there be an investigation into the biggest infrastructure sabotage in history, the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline, it's called Russian disinformation to even question the narrative. So the Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov said the U.S. government is treating, quote, any signals coming from Moscow as an element of a disinformation campaign, unquote. He said, meanwhile, Russia is, quote, literally ready to use any means at its disposal, unquote, to deter threats to its security and the safety of its leadership. Any means at its disposal. That includes all kinds of weapons, from electromagnetic pulse, nuclear. They will not tolerate an existential threat to their nation. So unfortunately, the arrogance, the unbridled arrogance of the so-called leadership of the United States is putting all of us in an extremely dangerous position. Now, otherwise, oh, and also I will say the Ukrainians, just more on this, have offered rewards. They are a Ukrainian millionaire, a billionaire, Volodymyr Yatsenko, has offered 549,000 US dollars, the equivalent of that, to any national weapons producer that manages to land a drone inside Moscow's Red Square during Russia's upcoming Victory Day celebration. This is where the United States has to weigh in and tell them to cut it out or all aid is cut off. But of course, you hear no such thing coming from us. Now, our encouraging this war is having great benefits for the American people because we have more banks about to be gobbled up by the big banks. More banks are going under. PacWest in Los Angeles, whose stocks lost 50% on Wednesday evening, and Western Alliance Bancorp in Phoenix. But there are various writers and economists, a Stanford University professor, who reports, quote, there are thousands of banks underwater. Let's not pretend it's only about Silicon Valley Bank and First Republic. Much of the US banking system is potentially insolvent, which really gets me to the point about Lyndon LaRouche. Lyndon LaRouche was already warning in the 1950s of the collapse of the United States because of certain financial policies, particularly with regard to auto sales and auto loans, that when the duration of the loan outlived the life of the automobile, that there was a shift from emphasis of physical production, the real world, to financial speculation, and that was deadly. And he warned then of a recession, which was only postponed by the presidency of John F. Kennedy, who of course was assassinated. After that, the post-industrial consumer economy continued, and LaRouche then warned about the Nixon administration bringing down the Bretton Woods system, which Nixon did in August of 1971, decoupling the dollar from the gold reserve system. And then there were a series of disastrous policies, importantly, the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act in 1999, and just 2008, the quantitative easing, et cetera. LaRouche gave a webcast in 2007 where he very forcefully said, there is no possibility of a non-collapse, none. He said in July of 2007 that the whole system was coming down as it did. And he also outlined remedies for the situation, finally culminating in 2014 with his proposed 4 laws, not an option and urgent necessity, starting with reinstating the Glass-Steagall Act, putting the system through an orderly bankruptcy or reorganization, nationalizing the Federal Reserve, and directing credit into those activities that actually increase the productivity of the American people, thereby creating the conditions where we would finally once again see the standard of living rise, the purchasing power of the dollar increase. So LaRouche, over many years, accurately warned about the catastrophic results of certain policies, including the danger of nuclear war, which he said we were headed toward after the assassination of Gaddafi in Libya in 2011. In particular, that this would spread to encirclement of Russia and China exactly as it has. And again, he outlined crucial steps that could be taken. So for all of this, great effort and expense was made to silence him, to black out and stop his attempts to become the president of the United States. And what I'm just going to play for you now are a couple of clips. One, a clip of Lyndon LaRouche in Talladega, Alabama in 2004 at an event commemorating the birthday of Martin Luther King. And we're just going to hear a few minutes from that. So Jose, if you could just go ahead and play that for our viewers.
We have 2 problems, I think, which should be the basis for reflecting on Martin's life today. One, we have a national crisis. Now, I'm not going to mince words, and I'm not going to do any political hacking, but the facts have to be told. This economy is collapsing. The situation, relatively speaking, in terms of basic economic infrastructure of the United States today is worse than in 1933 when Roosevelt came into the White House in March. That is, you look around you, infrastructure, energy, so forth, the conditions of life of our people around the world. And don't look in the big cities where they put on a facade and say things are fine. Look in the communities. For example, Detroit now has half the population it used to have. An industrial city is gone. Look around Birmingham, you see how the same thing is reported. It was never rich, but their sense of loss of this, that. That's the situation of the United States. Then you got an indifference to the problems of the United States. We have 48 at least of the 50 states are bankrupt, hopelessly bankrupt. That is, the states cannot possibly raise the tax revenue without sinking the economy further to meet the essential obligations of government. This is characteristic of at least 48 states. And it's getting worse. If you look at the cost of living, the increase of the cost of living as compared to what is officially reported, look at the prices of food in grocery stores over the past 6 months in the United States. Look at the fact that the US dollar, which not long ago was 83 cents would buy a euro. Today it takes $1.26 or 28 cents to buy a euro. The US dollar is collapsing in value. What is increasing is the amount of money associated with gambling. And the biggest form of gambling is occurring on Wall Street. The money is going in to drive up, for a purely speculative way, on side bets on the economy, to drive up the value of stock prices for some companies. And as soon as some company gets rich, the leaders of the company go to prison, like Enron. Because we have gone from the steel business to the stealing business, the nature of the economy. We're in trouble. We're in trouble on a world scale. Since January of 2002, when the present president made an unfortunate speech in the State of the Union address, the attitude toward the United States has fallen rapidly to the lowest I've ever seen among nations all over the world. Throughout Eurasia, throughout the Americas, the United States is despised where it was still at least respected or even loved before. We are in trouble. And look at the world. The world faces a great crisis, and the United States faces a great crisis in dealing with the world. The largest concentrations of population of the world are China, for example, 1.3 billion or more, India over 1 billion, then you have Pakistan, Bangladesh, and the countries of Southeast Asia. This is the greatest concentration of population on this planet. It's an emerging part of the world. The question is, what's the relationship of the United States to these people of Asia who represent, by and large, different cultural backgrounds than those of us in the United States or in Western Europe? How are we going to find peace in a troubled world? How are we going to find reconciliation in a troubled world with countries which have turned against us because of the war policies of Cheney and some others?
So that was the first clip. The second is just a few excerpts of public hearings that were convened to address crimes by the FBI and Department of Justice in targeting political leaders, something actually named Operation Operation Primitive Man, which was the name of an FBI operation to explicitly target elected officials simply because they were not white, because they were African American, and the case of Lyndon LaRouche. And there was a panel convened. You'll see J.L. Chestnut, who was an attorney for Martin Luther King. You will see Ramsey Clark, the former U.S. Attorney General. You will see Odin Anderson, who was LaRouche's attorney for many years. Ramsey Clark became LaRouche's attorney on the appeal because he was so outraged by what occurred in the LaRouche case. And you will see a Helga Zepp LaRouche. This is about 28 years ago now when this hearing occurred in 1995. So if you could show that clip, Jose.
This is the most incredible piece of FBI material, one of the most incredible pieces of FBI material that I've ever seen. And
CPUSA.
we're Communist Party. I'm going to get it. That's the Communist Party of the United States. What this suggests is that the Communist Party has let the FBI know that they want to eliminate Lyndon LaRouche for their political reasons. They consider him to be a politically dangerous person, and the Communist Party wants to eliminate him. If you look at the bottom, New York proposes submitting a blind memorandum to the Daily World to foster these efforts. Is the FBI climbing in bed with the Communist Party in order to effect the elimination of Lyndon LaRouche from the political scene? I think we all know what that means.
But in what was as complex and pervasive a utilization of law enforcement, prosecution, media, and non-governmental organizations focused on destroying an enemy. This case must be number one. There are some where the government itself may have done more and more wrongfully over a period of time. But the very networking and combination of federal, state, and local agencies, of executive and even some legislative and judicial branches, of major media and minor local media, and of influential lobbyist types, the ADL preeminently. This case takes the prize.
Henry Kissinger, who we all know by name and some probably remember by reputation and actions, was a very powerful man. Mr. LaRouche took exception with his policies, which he considered to be genocidal, got into a serious row with Mr. Kissinger. And Mr. Kissinger writes to William Webster, the director of the FBI. Here is, within the short period thereafter, Buck Revell, who was the head of counterintelligence for the FBI at the time, sent this memorandum by William Webster, who was contacted by David Abshire of PIFIAB. That's the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. And these same parties, Henry Kissinger and his colleagues, are now raising before PIFIAB the question as to whether LaRouche, because he seems to have funding from sources that they don't understand, is possibly operating as a foreign intelligence agent, and they want them to look into this. Now, what that does, and the words are bad enough, but the reality is terrifying. This triggers Executive Order 12333, which allows virtually any form of conduct, any activity, to be undertaken as long as it's under this national security cover. So this was the beginning of a national security covered operation against Mr. LaRouche and his colleagues.
The purpose can only be seen as destroying. It's more than a political movement. It's more than a political figure. It is those two. But it's a fertile engine of ideas. A common purpose of thinking and studying and analyzing to solve problems regardless of the impact on the status quo or on vested interests. It was a deliberate purpose to destroy that at any cost.
The most important in history is ideas, especially those ideas which move mankind forward, which are ideas which make the life of generations to come more human. And you can see it in those states which are governed by racism, like I saw it just in Alabama, where I thought Selma would be full of monuments for Martin Luther King, and I mean, I was really totally shocked to see that the opposite was true. You see, when the absence of ideas is the case, like the absence of civil rights, the absence of human rights, how much misery that does to the people. So, for me, the biggest crime, what happened to my husband, is not that he was innocently in jail. And, I'm not saying it was not a hard time, because it was. And, I mean, I can only say that, people should feel the heart pain of what also Patricia Morris expressed, that, this is done to real human beings. It's not just some figures and statistics. People suffer. Their whole lives are being destroyed. But the lack of the ability to have important ideas govern history, that is the biggest crime. I'm saying this because, to put a man of great ideas into jail is a crime all by itself because of the ideas. The reason why we were able to mobilize hundreds of parliamentarians and thousands of VIPs from around the globe Why would people from Africa sign the parole request for Lyndon LaRouche? Why would people from Latin America do this? Why would people from around the world, from Russia, why would people come out of completely different cultural worlds to fight for this man? Well, because we not only said this man must be free and his innocence must be proven, but many of them told me and others that they understand that the kind of change in global policy my husband is standing for, the kind of just new world economic order which allows the economic development of Africa, which allows the economic development of the developing countries of Eastern Europe, they say is the only hope for them, for their nation, as far away as it may be.
Great, thank you. So now what I would like to do is we have actually a brother and sister who have been collaborators of Lyndon LaRouche for a long time. Mike Billington, who was himself a political prisoner, one of the co-defendants of Lyndon LaRouche, who did spend, I think, over 10 years in prison, and then his sister, Margaret Billington Greenspan. And Mike, I won't say more by way of introduction because I'll let you tell people yourself what you'd like them to know.
Okay, thanks, Diane. Jose, you can put up the picture of my book. I'm going to bring up the question of the book I wrote the last couple of years I was in prison later on in this presentation, but I'm going to start by reading a quote from the preface of that book. And Jose, you're going to put that up? Do you have it there? Okay. Okay. The title of the book is Reflections of an American Political Prisoner, the Repression and Promise of the LaRouche Movement. And I'll come back to this later, but I'm going to read a paragraph from the preface just to sort of situate here the question of the corruption of the legal system. What I wrote there was that when notions of universal truth are replaced by popular opinion, as manipulated and defined by a ruling oligarchy, we have departed from the realm of the constitutional republic and are heading in the direction of a fascist society. In such an environment, even procedure rises above truth in the application of justice, as demonstrated by recent Supreme Court decisions allowing executions of those who are admitted to be most likely innocent, but whose right to appeal has passed a procedural time limit. Similarly, the fact that I and my associates remain condemned as felons, despite the overwhelming evidence on the record that those who brought these various prosecutions against us knew from the beginning that we were innocent of all charges, constitutes an indictment of the criminal justice system itself. Thus am I a political prisoner, a prisoner of conscience in America. So let me begin by noting that the current issue of Executive Intelligence Review has the article that Diane mentioned, Shut Down Anglo-American Break Up Russia Operation Now. This is the cover of this issue of EIR is, I don't know if that can be seen, but it has a picture of Zbigniew Brzezinski. This is actually from a pamphlet that was published in 1977 by Lyndon LaRouche called The Hostile Fantasy World of Zbigniew Brzezinski. Now, maybe some of the younger people watching today might not remember Zbigniew Brzezinski, but he was one of the leading British American intelligence operatives destroying the United States. 20 years later, after Lynn wrote this document, but 20 years later, Brzezinski wrote a book, published a book called Grand Chessboard, American Primacy and Its Geostrategic Imperatives. This was published in 1997. And what he's referring to there is the geopolitics of people like Halford Mackinder and other Anglophiles who launched so-called geopolitics back at the beginning of the 20th century. The policy being that in order to gain power, you have to destroy your opponents, the zero-sum game idea. And that kind of geostrategy and geopolitics was the core of imperial policy then and still today, as we're seeing now. In the book that Brzezinski published, called The Grand Chessboard, he has a map of Russia showing Russia divided into three parts. And his argument is that Russia must be destroyed as a unified nation. The current issue of EIR, the same one I just held up with Brzezinski on the cover, and the title of this is Brzezinski's Insanity Tours the United States and Threatens World War III. This contains this article that Diane referred to, Shut Down Anglo-American Break Up Russia Operation Now, by Gretchen Small and Karl Ausbud. And that this includes the map that was put out by the people that are running the current operation. They call themselves the Free Nations of Post-Russia Forum. And they published a map, which is contained in this article, which shows Russia broken up into 41 different parts, not just 3, but 41 different pseudo-nations. The irony of the map that they publish is that they have the gall to put the map of the foreign country that will be the colonial lord over each of these subdivisions of the once unified nation of the Federation of Russia. The US has a major chunk with the American flag on there. So this is the mentality of trying to provoke World War III that was around a long time ago, as demonstrated by the hostile fantasy world of Zbigniew Brzezinski, but has been at the core of the British effort to destroy the American system, to turn America into a colonial power, and one that would in fact launch a nuclear war against Russia and help destroy Russia one way or the other. So then how did Lynn get put in prison? Well, this is why. It's why he was targeted, because he was not only an opponent of this insane policy of demonizing and trying to start a world war with Russia, but he also offered a proposal to cure that problem. It's what became known as the SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative. He proposed to Ronald Reagan, whom he had met in the 1980 electoral campaign when they were both candidates for president, and had convinced Reagan of his idea that in order to collaborate with Russia, we had to get their scientific capacity, which was one of the greatest in the world, and our scientific capacity, also one of the greatest in the world, to collaborate on building a space-based anti-nuclear weapons system using new physical principles like particle beams, laser technologies, and so forth. This is what Reagan, who adopted LaRouche's idea and announced it on March 23rd of 1983 in his famous speech, where he called for the launching of the Strategic Defense Initiative based explicitly on Lynn's ideas, in which he said, this will make nuclear weapons obsolete. Now, these are fighting words to Henry Kissinger and to the British. The idea that Reagan was being somehow brought into the LaRouche circle with his ideas of ending the Cold War by collaborating on science and technology, both to end the danger of war, but of course, more importantly even than that, was the spin-off of such a commitment to scientific and technological progress in terms of industrialization of the entire globe, the kind of thing we see today with the Belt and Road. So this was the SDI, and Lynn always identified it's his idea of the SDI, which is what drove them to try to kill him or to put him in prison with the case. So they did indeed. They arrested him and they arrested 6 others. They called them the Alexandria 7. I was one of them because there were 7 of us who went on trial before a fixed crooked judge and a fixed jury in Alexandria, where we were not permitted to present the actual evidence of the government misconduct which led to the case itself. An earlier case in Boston, they had allowed us to present the evidence of the government misconduct, and that led to a breakdown of the trial completely, a mistrial, and after which the jury talked to the press and announced that they had already decided amongst themselves that LaRouche was innocent because of a clear case of government misconduct targeting him on false evidence. That wasn't allowed in the Alexandria trial, so I won't go through what happened in the trial, but it went through. We were all convicted. LaRouche was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. I was sentenced to 3 years in prison, 2 of the others 5 years, and so forth. And we went off to prison. I was soon thereafter pulled out of the federal prison and taken to Roanoke, Virginia, where the Commonwealth of Virginia was holding its own trial on exactly the same fraudulent charges, claiming that we were, when we borrowed funds from supporters for our political efforts, that we were actually selling securities without a license. A completely absurd argument that subsequently was ruled to be illegal in a court, but it didn't matter that was illegal. That's the basis on which they did it. So we, of course, argued that this was double jeopardy since they were having another trial on the same fake accusations. But double jeopardy doesn't count when it comes to LaRouche. So that went nowhere. And I went through another trial. In this case, we had the added nicety of a lawyer who turned against me and who collaborated with the judge, the crooked judge, to have me sent away for a psychiatric exam to try to prove that I was crazy for the fact that I wanted to have a jury trial, which of course is a fundamental right of every American citizen to have a jury trial when accused of something. But that, in my case, that was showing signs of mental instability, and they wanted to prove that with sending me off to UVA to be examined by a pack of friends of the networks that were running the cases against LaRouche to begin with. So I refused to participate in that, and we went ahead with the trial. I tried to have my lawyer replaced since he had turned against me, but the judge would hear nothing about that. He said, no, this lawyer is doing a fine job, and you shall continue, even though I had another lawyer who was ready to stand in and take over and actually wage a case. So there was no case presented. I was convicted. I was sentenced to 77 years in prison in the state of Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia, as they like to say. And given that I had a long sentence in front of me, I made a decision that I was going to spend some of my time in prison on a study of China and Asia. I figured China had a very, very long history, and it would probably take 77 years or so to really figure it out. So that's what I took up, that and Asia more generally. But I especially studied Chinese philosophy, studied Confucius and Mencius, and the Sung Dynasty and the 12th century Confucian Renaissance. And I compared especially those 12th century figures to the great Nicholas of Cusa in the West, who was one of the seminal minds that gave rise to the Christian Renaissance in Europe. And I showed the comparison between the best traditions within Christianity and those best traditions within China under the Confucian concepts, showed them to be very parallel and to have the same enemies, you might say, that the Platonic people in the West had as their opponents the Aristotelian types who rejected the idea of fundamental truth and the mind of man. And a similar thing existed in China against the Taoists and the legalists. I won't go into that now, but that's in my book. And I encourage you to get my book, by the way, which is available on Amazon. It's no longer available in our bookstore because we're out of print, but it's still available on Amazon. So that's what I largely spent my time doing. I also did a study of the rest of Asia, especially Southeast Asia, and studied the battle between the Americans and the British after World War II over what direction the rest of Asia was going to take, which was quite successful to a certain extent by the US against the British, who of course wanted to have it reduced to colonies again. But until the Vietnam War, with the Vietnam War, the US was sucked into becoming a British satrapy, a colonial power, and things went downhill from there. While I was doing that research and writing about these things, my wife, Gail, my late wife, Gail, was meeting many leaders across Asia and in Washington at the embassies, where we were mobilizing a force, really, between LaRouche interests and the Asian interests, which has developed and grown since that time, and is still very active today. So I'm going to just mention two other brief aspects of my time in prison, one of which happened during a period of a couple of years when one of my close friends and co-defendants, Paul Gallagher, many of you know Paul Gallagher, he's the economics editor for Executive Intelligence Review, among other things, that we were both in the same prison for a period of time, and together we organized a classical chorus that we organized the prisoners, some of them very serious criminals, meaning they had committed serious crimes, some less so. But about 20 of them agreed. I was able to teach them how to sing. I had been trained by a good friend of ours from Mexico, a maestro, who taught us the bel canto method of musical education, of singing. And I was able to teach, to some extent, that to these young men. And then we sang the music of Mozart and Beethoven. We sang the Prisoner's Chorus from Beethoven's opera Fidelio. We sang Bach. We sang Brahms. We would occasionally gather out on the rec yard where they were playing football and so forth. And we would have a group of men singing the Mozart Ave Verum Corpus to the tune of the noise from the rec yard. So these were memorable moments in prison. We did have a concert during the Christmas period, which was clandestinely recorded illegally. You weren't allowed to do that such thing, but there was a recorder in the church, and I was able to turn it on when we performed. So there's a very poor Fidelio recording of this wonderful concert that we conducted there. And then lastly, I'll mention that we did the book. You can put the book back up, Jose. And I wrote this book with the idea over the last 2 years that I was in prison that I had some time and that I had access to the histories of the LaRouche movement written by our associates over the years. And I thought it would be a good idea to have a book on the history of the LaRouche movement. It's not an official history. This was not, it wasn't brought about because I was writing a history of the LaRouche movement. I was just doing this, and it's from my perspective. So it's not really a universal history in that sense. But I wanted to convey how this movement had come about from the 1960s up and through the 1990s into the turn of the century, and had a wonderful time doing it. It was a huge task, but it was delightful in doing so. And I think it served quite a purpose. We had a number of young people who joined our movement around the time of the end of the 1990s and especially after 9/11. And many of these young people read the book with the idea of gaining some background to the history of the movement they were getting into, and I think appreciated it very much. And it's still available, as I mentioned. You can go on Amazon and still get this book today, and it's worth reading. It's worth getting a sense of how this unique movement in history came about and why it became such a major target of suppression by the British and their assets within the United States in order to prevent the reemergence of a truly Republican America, Republican in the small r sense, a truly constitutional republic, which we were once and we are no longer. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Mike. And we'll see if there's some questions. We're going to go now to Margaret Billington Greenspan, who can share her reflections on this history. Don't forget to unmute.
Okay, hi.
Good.
So thanks, Mike. There's a lot more I could say about Mike and his singing. One thing is that the night before Mike went to prison for the federal prison sentence, he and I performed the entirety of Schubert's Winterreise. Mike sang and I played the piano, and it was a memorable concert. I want to start the slideshow because we don't have a lot of time and I'm going to go through it pretty quick, but I want to just talk about a little bit about before the LaRouche case, some of the cases that occurred in the United States targeting good people, in particular elected officials who were committed to doing good for America, and they were targeted. So Jose, start with the first slideshow, please. I mean, the first slide. Okay, I guess it's up. I can't really tell, but the first slide is, there it is a picture of my wedding with my dear husband, Elliot. This was in 1982, and next to us is Senator Harrison Williams and his wife. Harrison Williams was targeted. He was a senator for, oh my God, from 1958 to 1982. He was a very strong advocate of workers, pensions, safety, health, migrant labor, urban mass transit. He did wonderful things in the Senate. He was targeted by something called ABSCAM, which was an FBI sting operation run to target congressmen and senators who were good guys. And what they did was they dressed up a convicted felon who was dressed up like an Arab sheik, and he went around to bribe congressmen and senators. Even though Senator Williams said no to the bribe, he was convicted anyway because they said, well, he might have taken the bribe. So that's Senator Williams. He's at our wedding because he was very happy that the LaRouche movement defended him all the way. And in particular, Elliot, who was personally very involved in defending Senator Williams. So he came to our wedding. The next slide, please. This is where Senator Williams gave a toast. He said, you guys, he said, I have seen how Elliot, like many others who work with LaRouche, have demonstrated the kind of courage and selfless commitment to the truth that is needed to get our nation back on track. If you keep it up, I assure you, you will be indicted. We didn't realize at the time how prophetic that was. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, here's another really great guy. Cornelius Gallagher, Congressman Neil Gallagher, who was in the Congress for, again, from 1959 to 1972, targeted by the FBI. He led a fight against the FBI for many years, particularly against J. Edgar Hoover. He advocated for against the invasion of privacy, the surveillance state. And there's a long story to that. And we have a wonderful video about him, which you can watch. I recommend it highly because he was a great guy. And he was targeted by the FBI after many, many years of fighting with them, and he was convicted. Next slide, please. He was a associate of next slide. That's this picture, yeah. He was associated very closely with the Kennedys. In fact, he was at the airport when the body of Jack Kennedy was brought back, and he was with Bobby Kennedy. And it was at that point that Bobby Kennedy said to Cornelius Gallagher, it was the big guy who targeted my brother, meaning Hoover. And after he was convicted of false charges and so forth, he said that the FBI was corrupt at the highest level, and he decried a secret police society that had outlaid $11 million to destroy him because of his work on civil liberties. So he was targeted, and he was then gone. Now the next slide shows a book that was written about Neil Gallagher, which in his fight for the Fourth Amendment, which is against illegal searches and seizures. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this is the book Mike was talking about. Mike wrote this book, by the way, on yellow pads, by hand, and he mailed the yellow pads out to me and then eventually to my mother, and we typed it on word processors. We didn't have computers back then. We typed it on word processors, and it was a lot longer than what the book ended up. So we spent a lot of time typing that book, but it was really, really interesting and a lot of fun. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a pamphlet that LaRouche put out about how people are so brainwashed about Lyndon LaRouche. And it's still the case, but it's not as bad as it was back then. But every time there was a news article or anything about Lyndon LaRouche, they called him political extremist Lyndon LaRouche. That's all you ever heard, political extremist Lyndon LaRouche. The picture next to that is Mike giving a speech the day before he went to serve his 77-year sentence. This was a rally against the death penalty in Virginia. And Mike gave a speech, and that was the very day he had to go off to start serving his 77-year sentence. And I just want to read a short quote from that speech. He said, "This is not just a sentence against me. It's a sentence against you and each and every citizen in this nation and around the world who refused to compromise. The reason for this sentence is a threat. The threat says that any of my associates or anyone who may decide to become one of our associates or anyone who fights against tyranny is going to be threatened with this same treatment. I think that this will terrorize people into backing out. They think that." He said, "I was particularly targeted because I refused to plea bargain. They told me that if I were to confess guilt to a crime I didn't commit, I would just say, yes, I did it. They would relieve me of this prison sentence, any prison sentence at all. In other words, I was told that I could win my freedom, my so-called freedom, if I would lie before the court, before the nation, before the world, before God, lie and say that this fight is a fraud." So, he stood up for the truth, and, he spent 10 years in jail, but he was free in the sense that he didn't compromise the truth. And he did a lot of good in prison. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's the pamphlet. Next slide. That's this. Okay, here we go. This is the creepy lawyer that, or the judge rather, that sentenced Mike to 77 years. He was completely corrupted. It's all detailed in all these documents, which you can read on the internet. I'm not going to go through it now because we don't have time. The next slide, please. Yeah, the whole point about these Virginia cases, and it wasn't just Mike. There was 5 defendants in the Virginia trials. They all had the same creepy judge, Wechstein, and they got very long sentences. Paul Gallagher, 41 years. Anita Gallagher, 46 years. Don Fowle, 25 years. Larry Heck, they were sentenced to very long sentences in order to destroy the movement. Why? Because they were the fundraisers. They were the best organizers we had. So they had to get rid of them so that our movement would be destroyed. Now, the other point is that the trial was based on the fact that loans that were taken were not being repaid. Why were they not being repaid? Because the government had shut down our companies, and we were unable to repay the loans. So that was a complete fraud. And that was overturned, but it was too late to save these people from being convicted. Next slide, please. Okay, this is Mike's nemesis. This is Ollie North. I'm sure that the young people today don't know as much about him as we do, but Ollie North targeted Mike particularly because Mike was fundraising from a woman that Ollie North wanted money from for the Iran-Contra affair, which was a drug running operation to support Contras in Nicaragua in return for drugs that were being brought over to the United States. Next slide. Okay, so it says here, the Contras move drugs, not by the pound, but by the bag, not by the bag, but by the ton, by the cargo plane load. We led a major campaign to defeat Oliver North, and it worked because he was running for U.S. Congress, I guess, and we made up a song. Bill Ferguson made up a song, and Marsha Mary Baker sang the song, Goodbye, Ollie, to the tune of Hello, Dolly, and it really worked. Next slide, please. Okay, now I was invited to Germany in 1999 by Helga Zepp LaRouche, and I had a tour of Germany, but also Eastern Europe. This is the Stasi Museum. This is the director of the Stasi Museum. The Stasi was the East German secret police who ran, total witch hunts against people and spied on everybody. And this guy showed me all around the museum. I had a private tour. This picture that he's showing here is the day that the Berlin Wall came down, November 9th, 1989. It was a very joyous moment. Next slide, please. I went to Hungary and to Slovakia. This is Tibor Kovacs, who himself was a political prisoner in Hungary and who was a very big supporter of LaRouche in the LaRouche cases, in Mike's trial and all the LaRouche cases. He had me meet with parliamentarians, professors, priests, and many people in Hungary who were very concerned and involved in trying to get justice for LaRouche. Next slide. This is wonderful human being, Joseph Mikloško, who was the leader of Slovakia. He was the vice president of Czechoslovakia. And he was the one who took me on tour, and I met with many people in Slovakia, parliamentarians, many people who were very concerned about LaRouche and were part of the effort to free him and my brother. Next slide. And this is a press conference I did in Slovakia. Pictured on the wall there were the Virginia defendants. See, Mike was still in jail, and LaRouche was out already, but these Virginia defendants were the ones that were targeted particularly because they were the best organizers we had. And that's me giving a press conference. There were about 13 press there. Next slide, please. And this is Gail, Mike's beautiful wife, Gail, in a picture with her meeting with Dr. Mahathir Mohamad from Malaysia. He was the Prime Minister of Malaysia. And he was very, very big supporter of LaRouche and the cases around Mike and the others. Next slide, please. And this is Mike showing his expertise, giving a speech about China. We're very proud of Mike and his wonderful work that he accomplished in prison. He became a real expert on China and Asia, as he said. And that's all I have.
Well, thank you very much, Margaret. That was actually wonderful. And I really appreciate you're showing the congressman and others, because you get a sense of the pathway of the United States to the point where it is today, where I mean, you can't even say certain things on YouTube or Twitter or in the classroom or on the street corner or on your cell phone. You know, it's come a long way. And I hope that people watching, there's some interesting comments. One person named Christopher Cruz said that he met you, Mike, when you came to his country 20 years ago, and he read your book and loved it. And there's my friend Thomas McCardle, who I think is in Australia, commenting, what a shame, this gentleman was right on every count. But what more would you like to add, Mike? Do you have any additional thoughts on this? And don't forget to unmute there.
I don't have much more to say. Thank you very much, Margaret. That was a delight for me too, to see that survey of the history of that era. It was an amazing time. I think if people then knew how horrendous it would become, that what would happen to the LaRouche movement, and today what you have with Assange and with the effort to literally militarize the FBI and use it to totally disrupt and destroy any chance of actual honest elections, and as Diane was pointing out, also censoring virtually everything, making it impossible even to share ideas, let alone to campaign and win elections on the power of ideas. And that's what made people hate LaRouche, is that he represents, as Ramsey Clark said, that this was a fertile engine of ideas, and it was ideas that move history, even though the oligarchy likes to think that they're the lords of the universe, and what they say is the laws, is the rules-based order, as they like to say now. But that's not what moves history. And ultimately, if people have the courage to stand up and speak the truth to power, then there's no reason not to be optimistic that because we have a moment of total crisis in the world, it is a moment of crisis, but it's a moment of tremendous opportunity where virtually the entire world has turned against the militarism of the US and the British. They're rejecting the sanctions on Russia. They're absolutely refusing to decouple from China, who is offering real development through the Belt and Road, an idea that LaRouche introduced to the Chinese back in the 1990s, because they prefer development to war. It's pretty simple in a sense. So, I mean, this is a great moment in history, and it's very valuable to review the background to this and how it came about, how the LaRouche movement came about, and what we have in our hands right now is the result of the fact that LaRouche fought for the truth, knowing full well that it would not make us popular, that we'd be persecuted and prosecuted as we were, but that by sticking to the truth, he knew that when his warnings of what was about to happen, that we were heading for economic disintegration and war, that when that happened, people would look back to see who was telling the truth and who was lying. And the conferences that the Schiller Institute has been sponsoring, and actually other conferences that Diane has been sponsoring, demonstrate that people are coming to us because they see this as the platform where people have the power and the right to speak the truth. And that's why these conferences have been so important and so powerful as they have been, which I encourage you all to go to the schillerinstitute.com and look under the link for conferences and watch some of these conferences. Just look through the list of speakers from all over the world, and why they come to the Schiller Institute platform as the place where they know they have the opportunity to both meet with others who have the same commitment, but also have the power to tell the truth against the anti-truth media and government forces that we're dealing with every day.
Margaret, I think we're going to wrap up soon, but what thoughts do you have about anything?
No, I'm just very grateful for Mike's courage and the courage of all of those who faced prison and faced it without breaking down. And I think people should do what Mike did, and don't be afraid of being attacked or slandered. You have to stand up for the truth, and we can do that, and we will win.
I think that's true. And I think this underscores why those of us and people listening who have been associated with LaRouche for all these years, that is our calling card. How do people know they can trust us? Because we didn't cave, we didn't slither under a rock. We continued to fight in spite of incredible adversity. And when you review some of what was done to us, I think Ramsey Clark was still correct. Even with the witch hunt and political targeting of former President Donald Trump, if you look at what was done to this association over all those years, how many people were put on trial, how many people went to jail, how many publications were shut down, as Ramsey Clark said, this takes the cake. And I would say conversely that shattering this, people getting over their fear, once people are no longer afraid, then fear doesn't work. And that's when we will get the break and the shift in the policies that is so desperately needed right now. Or if you really must be afraid, then please be afraid of the annihilation of the human race. Be afraid of the right thing, and then the other things won't seem nearly so daunting. So that's what I would like to say. And we have running the AV for us, one of our fearless associates, Jose Vega, who was on the fireside chat last night and has been leading all these interventions around the country. And again, this topic came up last night as well, fear. Why don't people stand up? Well, I'm afraid. I don't want to have an encounter with the police. I don't want to be manhandled. We don't have anything to lose at this point. So I'd like to thank both of you, Margaret and Mike, for joining me tonight. I thank everyone for listening. Please go to sareforsenate.com and sign up to volunteer and to donate to this campaign. Tomorrow at 2 p.m., there will be, I think, further development of this topic on the LaRouche organization website, thelarouche.org. And please find your courage and speak the truth. Thanks very much, and I hope to see you next week, and have a happy celebratory Victory Day on Tuesday, May 9th, everyone.
Thank you.